Hey guys, Kenna here. Today we're going to be looking at the process of photosynthesis. Now, if you did the photosynthesis by the book activity, you should have a pretty good handle on some of the big ideas here. So we're going to highlight those key processes and key players in this process, and that'll help go ahead and hone in what is the most important things that you'll need to go ahead and know moving forward. Okay, so today we're going to go ahead and focus on photosynthesis. Next class, we'll go ahead and talk about cellular respiration. And all of this has to do with cell energy. And it's going to include those ATP, ADP molecules we talked about a couple classes ago. All right, so let's begin by starting to look at our essential questions. Number one, what are the reactants and products of photosynthesis? Now, if you're not remembering, remember reactants are those things that start the process, and products are those that you finish with at the end. Number two, what role does chlorophyll, that's the key pigment we're going to talk about today, play in photosynthesis? Number three, does chlorophyll's color impact how does it do its job? And number four, what are the two parts of the photosynthesis process and where do they take place? So kind of make sure that you're keeping track of these essential questions as we go ahead and go through and make sure that you're ready to go ahead and answer these questions. All right, so let's start out with the word itself. The word photosynthesis actually comes from the Greek photo, which means light, and from synthesis, which means to put together. So literally translated, the word photosynthesis means using light to put something together. In this case specifically, we're looking at carbohydrates. Now, we're going to also focus a little bit more in on a specific carbohydrate, and that's the glucose molecule. But carbohydrates in general, if you go ahead and watch the Edpuzzle video, you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, if photosynthesis means putting together with light, what do you think chemosynthesis means? That's right. Chemo actually means chemical. And so this is to put together with chemicals. And most of all the energy that we have on our planet comes from photosynthesis. But there is a small group of organisms down at like the deep sea benthic vents that go ahead and have their whole food chains based on chemosynthesis. You have some bacteria that can convert the materials coming out of those hydrothermal vents, and they go ahead and get feasted on by creatures, and there's a whole life cycle and system that's down at the deep dark parts of the ocean at these little smoker vents, and that's based on chemosynthesis, but that makes up a tiny fraction of the actual energy coming into these systems. So when we start looking at the history of what we know about photosynthesis, there are a whole bunch of different individuals who have contributed to our knowledge. There are experiments performed by Van Helmont, Priestley, Ingenhousz, and many others. Too many, honestly, to go ahead and mention here. But ultimately, what we've discovered is this basic idea. In the presence of light, plants transform carbon dioxide and water into glucose and release oxygen. Okay? So we want to go ahead and think about that in terms of the chemical reaction that's occurring. It's actually a series of lots of different chemical reactions, but ultimately, what is the net input and output in terms of the chemistry for this particular equation? So photosynthesis uses the energy from sunlight to convert water and carbon dioxide into oxygen and the high energy sugar glucose. Now, let's go ahead and start looking at this chemical reaction. So what are our two reactants? If you said water and carbon dioxide, you would be right. Let's go ahead and start with carbon dioxide. So the chemical symbol for carbon dioxide is CO2. Now, notice that 6 out in front. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. The next one that you mentioned probably was water. And again, notice that that 6 is there. Water is H2O. None of these chemical reactions would happen without the assistance of, if you remember, activation energy. So in this particular instance, in photosynthesis, the activation energy comes from the sunlight. Okay, it's going to be captured by the organism that does photosynthesis and used to trigger this whole process. So we've got energy, and that's coming from the sun. Then we're going to use all of those materials, the carbon dioxide and the water, and the activation energy from the sun to go ahead and create our products. So remember, products are those at the end. And we're going to focus primarily on C6H12O6. This is our supersugar that we'll talk a lot about. This is glucose. And then we will release oxygen into the atmosphere. And while this is often talked about as a byproduct of this reaction, I don't want you to really think about it as a waste because these are cycles. And so photosynthesis feeds into cellular respiration, and cellular respiration feeds back into photosynthesis to help maintain a homeostatic balance on our planet. Okay. But notice that there's the 6 on the oxygen, but not on the glucose. What you're doing here is you're balancing the equation to make sure that all the pieces fit together. So in order to get that C6 that we see in glucose, you have to have 6 carbon atoms. And we get that by including 6 CO2. Okay? When you count up all the hydrogen atoms, you have 12 H12. In order to get that from H2O, you have to have 6 of them. Okay, so this is an important thing to look at when we start trying to balance numbers. And if you guys move on to go ahead and take chemistry, IB Chem, this is going to be an important process of balancing that you guys will do frequently. Okay, so that's the big equation that we want to make sure that you have, okay, both in words and in symbols. So kind of keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and give you a little video to introduce some of the basic ideas and the overall importance of what we're talking about in terms of photosynthesis, and then we'll go ahead and move on.
When traced back to its source, the energy used by all living things is the sun. Only plants, algae, and some single-celled organisms have the ability to carry out photosynthesis. Biologists call them autotrophs, or self-feeders. Organisms that cannot photosynthesize are called heterotrophs. Human beings are heterotrophs, as are all other animals and many single-celled organisms. The harvesting of light from the sun through photosynthesis is a complicated chemical process with many stages, but essentially what occurs is that light provides the energy to convert water and carbon dioxide from the air into glucose and oxygen. Glucose is a sugar plants use as a source of energy. Photosynthesis actually occurs in the leaves of plants. Inside the leaves are cells with organelles called chloroplasts, and inside the chloroplasts are flattened sacs called thylakoids. Within the thylakoids are clusters of chlorophyll molecules called photocenters. Photons of light are absorbed by these arrays of molecules. 4 electrons from the chlorophyll are boosted to an excited state, and they leave the molecule. To replace these missing electrons, 2 molecules of water are broken apart, resulting in 4 hydrogen protons plus an oxygen molecule, which is released into the atmosphere. Virtually all of the oxygen in our air has been created in this way. Meanwhile, the 4 energized electrons from the chlorophyll pass through a system of electron carriers called an electron transport chain. As electrons are passed from one compound to the next in the chain, the released energy is captured by enzymes which converts ADP to ATP. Coenzymes such as NADP+ that act as electron carriers also assist in the synthesis of ATP. This ATP is used in the second half of photosynthesis. The next part of the process, called the Calvin-Benson cycle, is carried out by enzymes located in the stroma of the chloroplast and doesn't require any light. In this cycle, the ATP generated in the first half of photosynthesis is used to build organic molecules of glucose from atmospheric carbon dioxide. This glucose is the final product of photosynthesis. Plants use some of this glucose for their own energy needs and store the rest. When herbivores eat plants, they consume the glucose stored in the cells of the plants. By breaking down this glucose, herbivores convert ADP to ATP, and this is the source of the energy that they need to survive. Even carnivores that never eat plants use photosynthesis indirectly when they eat animals that have eaten plants. In that way, all animals are dependent on photosynthesis for their source of energy.
Okay, so a lot of key things came out of that video. One, I hope you noticed as it was showing you the Calvin-Benson cycle that it goes through 6 turns, which should be a big thing for you because the glucose molecule C6H12O6 has 6 carbons. And so CO2, which only has 1 carbon, has to go through this process 6 times in order to produce that 6 carbon sugar. The other thing that's important to notice from the video is it says that almost all of the oxygen on our planet was created in this way. And this is an important piece of the history of our planet that a lot of people miss. And that's the fact that our early Earth was pretty hellish and it was not very receptive to life as we know it today. But over time, the production of these photosynthetic organisms eventually leads to a large increase in the oxygen produced on our planet. So much so that we were able to support giant insects. You think about maybe something about the size of a California condor, but it's a dragonfly. You're talking about scorpions that are the size of alligators. You're talking about millipedes that could be 8 to 10 feet long. Now, this was only possible because these types of insects breathe by absorbing oxygen in through their skin. They don't have a lung system. And so there have to be much higher concentrations of oxygen in the atmosphere than there are today. Now, over time, as you started getting organisms that utilize that oxygen, so it no longer is a waste product, you begin seeing more of a balancing out and you start developing lower levels of oxygen, more like what we would go ahead and see today. Okay. And so these are two major things to kind of take away from this process of photosynthesis. It's very finely tuned so that it has 6 turns to go ahead and produce a 6 carbon molecule, and that we have all the oxygen that we really breathe thanks to this process and wouldn't exist without it. So be thankful for your plant neighbors. Okay. So here's an overview of photosynthesis again. Okay, remember your reactants are here on the left, CO2 and H2O. These are the things that are put in to the chloroplast to go ahead and allow these chemical reactions to occur. None of it would happen without activation energy coming from light energy. Okay, it doesn't have to be the sun, but that's the typical source. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more here in a little bit about these structures inside the chloroplast, but remember that the chloroplast is this organelle that's responsible for carrying out photosynthesis, not found in animal cells. And then we go ahead and produce our 2 key products, glucose and oxygen. And remember, glucose is that supersugar C6H12O6. So just how much glucose are we talking about here? Well, plants make enough glucose to be used during the night and on cloudy days when they don't get enough sunlight. So this process goes as fast as much as they can do in the time allotted. Okay, so as long as there's sun, they're making more and more glucose. The extra glucose is stored in the plant's leaves and other parts. The tissues of the plant itself is made up of starches that are converted in terms of polymerization. If you remember our macromolecules, those sugars are bound together to create starches, cellulose, these key carbohydrates that make up the actual structures of the plant. Okay, now there's one more thing that's really important for this process to be able to occur. If we're going to use light and sunlight in particular to go ahead and act as the activation energy for these chemical reactions, how do we capture that? And that is done through the use of a really important molecule known as chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll is a pigment and it happens to have the color green. Now, remember that the light that reaches the Earth from the sun is what we call white light. And it's a mixture of all the different wavelengths of light. Okay. Typically, we think about the rainbow, right? Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Plants then gather the sun's energy with these light absorbing molecules called pigments. And it's a little different than what we typically probably taught you when we were in middle school. So let's go ahead and take a little bit of a closer look. Now, there are actually two main types of chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Both of them absorb slightly different spectrums of light. And we'll go ahead and try and take a look at that in terms of an activity today. So chlorophyll absorbs light well in the blue and red regions of the spectrum, but not as much in the green. And you'll go ahead in your activity today and look at some experimental evidence for this. Okay. Remember that when you see a color, when you see somebody that's wearing, say, a red shirt, what you're seeing is the color or wavelength of light that's being reflected off that shirt. So when it hits your eyes, that's the wavelength that's coming back, and your brain interprets that as a particular color. All right, lots more we could talk about that, but we'll move on for now. There are two halves to the photosynthesis process. Okay, the first half is what we call the light reactions, and this is what takes place requiring light to be absorbed to go ahead and use those chlorophyll molecules. The other half, commonly known as the dark reactions, is more correctly known as the Calvin-Benson cycle. I personally don't really like the term dark reaction because it does not only occur at dark. Okay, it does not wait until nighttime to happen. The term simply refers to the fact that it doesn't require sunlight in order to take place because it uses the captured energy of the light reactions in order to go ahead and happen. So Calvin-Benson cycle is actually the more correct term when we go ahead and talk about the second half of photosynthesis. Here's another overview, and I actually like this one even better. And we can go ahead and start talking about what happens. Remember, photosynthesis takes place at the chloroplast, that's the key organelle, which is only found in plants and some bacteria. And we have two reactants that we're going to need. The first one we're going to use for the light-dependent reactions is water. Electrons are going to be boosted in the thylakoid membranes in the light-dependent reactions. That requires activation energy that comes from, that's right, from light. In particular, usually sunlight. That sunlight's going to go ahead and break apart those water molecules to replace the lost electrons and release oxygen into the atmosphere. Those hydrogen ions are going to go into an electron transport chain, which is going to charge up ADP into ATP and NADP plus into NADPH. Those energy carrier molecules, which are super important, we've highlighted ATP a lot already, are again going to go on to the Calvin-Benson cycle to go ahead and produce the sugars that we need, in particular glucose, that the plant's going to use to feed itself. What's the other reactant that we use in photosynthesis? It's water and, that's right, carbon dioxide. And that's going to go into the Calvin-Benson cycle. And the big thing you need to know is that it goes through this complicated process, producing a wide variety of intermediate products. But ultimately, it does 6 turns in the Calvin-Benson cycle to produce the supersugar glucose C6H12O6. Now, this is all taking place, remember, inside the chloroplast. So if you were to go ahead and zoom in on a plant leaf, you're going to see these little cells, and those cells are going to have these tiny little bean-shaped organelles known as chloroplasts that have that pigment chlorophyll in them. Okay, this is a nice graphic representing that chloroplast. You can see that here is a thylakoid membrane. A stack of thylakoids is known as a granum. Okay, and the stroma is this kind of gel-like fluid in between those stacks of thylakoids. Now, we really are sure that it does look like this, and this is actually an electron microscope image this is using a TEM, you can actually see these dark little stacks inside that are the thylakoid membranes, and you can see the spaces in between that represent the stroma. Okay. So the light reaction takes place inside the chloroplast. The chloroplasts contain these little sac-like photosynthetic membranes called thylakoids, and these thylakoids are arranged in stacks called grana. The thylakoids contain chlorophyll and proteins known as photosystems. Okay, and these photosystems, which contain the chlorophyll, are where the actual capture of energy happens. This is where the sunlight comes in. So, using light energy from the sun, we are going to manufacture ATP and NADPH from ADP and NADP+. We are converting light energy into chemical energy. Okay. Now I want to go ahead and highlight this because to me this is one of the more important pieces is that we are going to take this light energy from the sun and we are going to convert this into chemical energy. So this is coming from the sun and we are going to convert this primarily into ATP. Yes, there's NADPH as well, but ATP is the primary stored chemical energy that we use to walk, talk, think, and blink. In order to do this, we are going to consume water, okay? Water, so this is our reactant, and we are going to produce oxygen, which is going to be a product. And the location where that happens is the thylakoid membranes. All right, so let's take a look at the important structure of this electron transport chain. Now, you are not going to be tested on this, okay? This is far more detail than you're going to be required to know if you were to go on and take something like IB biology or plan on taking biology in college. This is something that they will expect you to know then. But for what we're doing, this is not need to know material. What I do want to highlight as we go through this, however, is the fact that when we go ahead and take a look at this structure, hopefully you're recognizing that this is a glycerol head. Okay, these are fatty acid tails. This is that lipid bilayer we just finished talking about when we were going over cell transport. So all of these chemical reactions that we're talking about in terms of photosynthesis for the light reactions are actually taking place in membranes. Okay, so all of these different proteins you see here are embedded in the membrane and they're going to do different things to go ahead and pass on the electrons. So you can see here, 1, 2, these nice green ones, these are our photosystems. Now, interestingly enough, the first one we're going to go ahead and deal with, if I can get this to go ahead and come up, is photosystem 2. That seems really weird. Why would we start with photosystem 2 and not photosystem 1? They were actually named in the order they were discovered, not in the order the body goes ahead and uses them. And remember, I don't mean body like our body. I mean like the body of the plant. Okay. So photosystem 2 begins by going ahead and capturing some of this light energy. That then is going to go ahead and boost off some electrons, which then enter the electron transport chain. As they get moved from one protein to the other, they're going to pump all these hydrogen ions to this side of the membrane, the inner thylakoid space. That's going to make this side of the membrane hypertonic. Okay? If that's hypertonic, then the outer part or stroma is going to be, that's right, hypotonic. Well, they don't like to stay in that. And so as we go ahead and keep pumping those electrons through, we're going to absorb a little bit more energy from the sun, in this case at photosystem 1. It's going to re-energize those electrons, which will be captured by NADP plus to create NADPH. Okay. All those hydrogen ions that we had really trapped up here at the top of the inner thylakoid space then begin to fall through a facilitated diffusion protein, kind of spinning a little turbine here. And there's a great video showing how this happens from HHMI, and I've linked it in our Ed puzzle. So when you go back to do that, you might take a look at it if you're interested. And as this turbine kind of spins, you got to think about it like a water wheel, and it's going to convert that ADP into ATP, which is our high energy molecule that we're going to go ahead and rely on. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at this whole process. Ultimately, we're going to go ahead and create ATP formation, and let's go step by step through it one more time. So, step one, pigments in photosystem 2 are going to absorb the light. The energy is absorbed by electrons. Those electrons come from where? That's right, the water molecules. Water is then broken down into two electrons, two hydrogen ions, and an oxygen atom. The H plus is released inside the thylakoid membranes, making it even more hypertonic, and the oxygen is combined to go ahead and released into the air for the oxygen that you're breathing at this very moment. Those electrons are going to move through the electron transport chain, and their energy is used to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane. This creates a charge difference on either side of the membrane, and it's enough to go ahead as it goes through facilitated diffusion to cause that pump to go ahead and make some ATP. So as those hydrogen ions fall through the protein called ATP synthase, it's going to spin like a turbine and attach phosphate to the ATP, making it back into ATP. Then we have these energy depleted electrons at the end. In photosystem 1, they get re-energized with more light energy. They're tacked on to NADP plus along with a hydrogen ion or a proton, and that becomes NADPH. So, really important, photosystem 2 is ultimately going to produce ATP by making it incredibly hypertonic on the inner thylakoid membrane. And then we're going to use those extra electrons to form NADPH at photosystem 1, which will both be carried on to the Calvin-Benson cycle so we can make glucose, our super sugar. So if the light-dependent reactions take place in these thylakoid membranes, we have to remember that the stroma is where we're going to have the Calvin-Benson cycle. Now, originally named the Calvin cycle after Melvin Calvin, the man who discovered the process, it was later adapted to Calvin-Benson because it was considered that there were lots of major contributions by his colleague Benson, who kind of got overlooked in the naming process, and so they've added his name back later. In the Calvin-Benson cycle, you have carbon dioxide from the air, which remember has one carbon atom, and we're going to go ahead and use that 6 times to manufacture a 6-carbon sugar called glucose. Now it takes 6 CO2 to make 1 glucose molecule. All right. In order to do this, it's going to utilize the ATP and NADPH that we made in the light reaction to go ahead and build glucose. And the reason our bodies do this rather than just building up a huge stockpile of ATP is that the glucose is more stable long term. And if you're going to try and store it even longer term than the glucose, you go ahead and start chaining glucose together and you go from a sugar to a starch. Remember, going from a monomer to a polymer, like we talked about when we were going over our macromolecules. Again, this occurs in the stroma and does not require light, which is why some people like to use the term dark reactions. But remember, it does not wait for the dark. It actually occurs during the light. It just uses stored energy so that this half does not require any light. So here's the Calvin-Benson cycle. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going through it, but ultimately you start with CO2, which remember has 1 carbon atom. So we need 6 of them. We're going to take energy, ATP and NADPH from the light reactions. It's going to go through here 6 times to manufacture a 6-carbon sugar to go ahead and make our glucose or any other starchy materials, carbohydrates that we want to go ahead and visit. The last thing I wanted to go ahead and leave you with was this idea of absorption of light. I'm going to leave this here for a minute. I don't want to talk a lot about it because I'm actually saving this for your activity. But there are 2 different types of chlorophyll, as we mentioned before, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and they absorb at slightly different wavelengths. Okay. So as you go ahead and take a look at the activity we have for you today, I want you to be thinking about where optimal absorption is, and so what light is the most important for plant growth. and realize that this is going to be slightly different from plant to plant depending on the type of chlorophyll they have as the majority of their chlorophyll. Okay, so that's what I've got for you guys today. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care, guys.